Hello ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome back to the third episode of our JG7's classroom series, which so happens to be also the third episode on aircraft performance in general. So today we are going to look at the fourth chapter, which will cover turn performance. So we are going to explore how to maximize our turn performance in flight and how to hence get the best out of our aircraft. So stay tuned while I'm getting set up. Alright, so what is the objective of today's lesson? Just a quick recap. We've looked at some performance limitations both for straight flight and turn flight. We have worked out how the turn flight actually works and what are the determining factors here. How do we get our centripetal force? How do we maintain level flight? What do we need to achieve to maintain altitude while turning, and so on and so forth. And we've looked at the principal physics of turn flight. But since we are obviously combat pilots or aspiring combat pilots, we want to now know how to maximize our turn performance in a horizontal or level turn, if you will. So the assumptions here are at the moment that we want to maintain our altitude and we want to maintain our speed constant. So our excess power, PS, is supposed to be 0. Okay. Now, because that means we are working energy neutral. When we get to the energy diagrams in chapter 2, we will see what changes when we adjust or when we allow the specific excess power to be non-zero. That simply means in short that we would have to invest energy or we would gain energy from our maneuvering. Okay, but before we get into it, what does maximizing turn performance actually mean? So, in order to maximize our turn performance, we have two values to look at and two quantities, let's say, to optimize. That would be 1 radius and 2 turn rate. Depending on what fight we are in, we would look at either of the two and try to maximize that. For example, in a 2-circle fight, but we will get to that terminology in future lessons, I would want to maximize turn rate to get as fast as I can around my turn circle. In a 1-circle fight, which is a nose-to-nose fight, I would want to keep my radius as small as possible to get my nose on target first before the other guy gets his nose onto me. So that would be the scenarios when to look for what of the two quantities. But in general, we remember, we store this accessibly into our mind's memory. Turn rate, we want to maximize. Turn radius, in general, we want to minimize to maximize our overall turn performance. So, let's start with turn rate then. Again, these assumptions apply. So as you can derive from the picture here on the right, our centripetal force is equivalent to our horizontal lift force that's pulling us into the turn. And what we've worked out in the previous video is how the centripetal force is connected to turn rate and turn radius using Newton's laws of motion. F equals m times a, and omega squared r is a. So that's our circular acceleration. Okay, now using that equation we can solve for omega, which is our turn rate, and then we get to here. Unfortunately, this equation here is not quite useful because there are quantities in here that we cannot determine in flight, that we cannot control, that we cannot monitor, and that we cannot grasp so easily. So at the moment, this is not really telling us a lot. Also, at best, if we can, we would like to eliminate, for example, r out of this equation, so we see, because these are both quantities of interest, and having one inside the equation or the other is a bit troublesome. So one can do some math, and I will do that later. But I just want to go over the results real quick, so later on you can keep track on what's happening. So if you do a little bit of math using some equations, plotting them in, rearranging stuff, as I said, we will see this in a minute on the whiteboard, we can get to the following equation. So our turn rate equals gravitational constant divided by our speed, airspeed, times square root of load factor squared minus 1. So this is much better because this is something we can work with. Load factor we can monitor. Some planes have gauges like the P-51, and airspeed we can also monitor. G is a constant. Awesome. Alright, so what do we do? How do we maximize this? Well, there's two quantities we can adjust. This is one, our load factor, and secondly our speed. And as you can see, since speed here is in the denominator, we want to make this as small as possible. What is the smallest speed we can fly? Well, our stall speed at a given load factor. So we rewrite the equation real quick, and then we look for the limit, which is the maximum turn rate. So we've established we need to be as slow as possible, so this gets as large as possible, and we need to have a large n. And both considerations in conjunction is written down here. So for v, we enter our stall speed depending on our load factor. This equation we've also derived from previous videos. And then we want to have n toward n max. We could technically explore what would happen if n went toward infinity, but that's not possible. So there will be a maximum load factor that our airframe can sustain without taking damage. So this is what we want to go for. And then we plug this in, rearrange it, simplify the equation, and we end up with this. And that's something we can analyze. And a quick sanity check to see if that all makes sense. If we were to plug in infinity here in this equation, as I said, instead of n max you would have n written here and then plug in infinity, then we would get an infinite turn rate, which obviously makes sense because an infinite, let's say, load factor is sort of representative of an infinite centripetal force, and hence we would have an awesome turn rate. So that makes sense because that would go to zero. Oops, sorry, that would go to zero, and that would go to infinity. So overall, that would be infinity. But our maximum is our n max. So we plug this in here, and now you could technically do some math. You can figure out what is the maximum load factor my airplane is capable of maintaining, either instantaneously or for a short period of time. And then you can plug in your sustained load factor, and we've talked about this in previous videos. For World War II fighter, it's somewhere between 2 and 3.5 G, depending on what you fly. You could plug this in there and basically the stall speed in level flight VS0 is usually known. So, and then you can calculate now basically without anything, without any other values, your theoretical turn rate that you can expect to get out of your aircraft. And here you can also see why it is so, why good or well-turning aircraft like the Spitfire would have the advantage, because they can do slower stall speed. So assuming both planes can fly a same or similar load factor, either maximum instantaneous or as in our case at constant speed and constant altitude, so energy neutral. So let's just assume 3G. The guy with the slower stall speed in level flight will have a better turn rate. So here again that makes sense. So if your aircraft is heavy or has small wings and the stall speed is high, then there's nothing you can do about it other than to accept that you might not get the same turn rate out of it as compared to an aircraft with a slower stall speed. The only way to overcome this is if you were flying an aircraft with so much thrust that you could potentially sustain higher load factors, and then at some point, I mean, you could do the math. How much higher would my load factor have to be to overcome a higher stall speed? That is something that would be possible. So it's not just stall speed, but since we are talking about conventional airframes with more or less similar thrust to weight ratios that are in the same ballpark, you can assume that, as I said, the lower the stall speed of an aircraft, the better it turns, because the more turn rate it can generate. Now, we've also talked about it, that you can lower your stall speed using high lift devices such as leading edge or trailing edge flaps. Leading edge flaps in World War II fighters not present, or at least not controllable manually. The 109 does have some, but you cannot control them manually. So that would help here to increase the turn performance a little bit. But be mindful, if you drop your flaps too far down, you increase your drag. You might not be able to sustain the same load factor as you would if you did not use any flaps. Right, so before we get to the equation derivation part, let's talk about turn radius. Now, as I said, same principles apply. Same assumptions apply. This also still applies, just so you keep it in your memory. And let's talk at turn radius. So we use the same equation for horizontal lift force, which is our centripetal force, is equal to omega squared r and the mass of the aircraft. We rearrange this equation and put r on the left side, everything else on the right side, and we get to this. So just divide by omega, divide by mass, and you end up here. Again, we would have to do a little bit more rearranging, plugging in equations, which we are going to do. But for those of you that might not be interested in this, I wanted to discuss the results and put this section at the very end, so you don't have to skip through the video and you can just watch it in one go. And for those that are interested that can stay, you can stay and watch it to the end, going over the math here. Okay, so if we do our rearranging here again, we'll get this equation after all. Again, we have similar quantities as before. There's only g. our airspeed that we can control and our load factor that we can control. So again, a nice and neat equation that we can use even in flight, so to speak. Okay, so let's have a look. So R is equal to V squared divided by G times 1 over the square root of n squared minus 1. Looks a bit different, it's basically reversed, and we have the square because R is not squared as compared to omega in this initial equation. That's how you get here. Okay, now again, we want to check, so quick check where we would have to go to minimize R, and then we go over the formal description. So in order to minimize R, again, the two quantities that we can control, we would want to minimize airspeed, and we would want to maximize n. Because we maximize n, this becomes smaller. The lower n here, the lower this portion is, and the larger R is. So maximizing n, minimizing speed. That sounds awfully or suspiciously similar or equivalent to what we've discussed here. As you can see, again, for turn rate, it was the same. Lower turn speed, maximize n. Same story here. So, what is the slowest speed we can fly? Well, our stall speed, depending on our load factor. Since this time it is squared, we would have our stall speed in level flight VS0 squared here, times square root of n squared, which is n, divided by g here, and this part. Then we do some rearranging, simplify before we look at the limit. But what we would then end up with is exactly this. So we have the Vs naught squared divided by g times 1 over 1 minus 1 over n max squared. Does it make sense? Let's do the sanity check. Alright, so a quick sanity check if that actually makes sense. First, we would want to look at if it was possible to do n infinity. So if we were to be able to generate an infinite load factor, generally speaking, when would this equation become, or this term become the smallest? Well, if this part here in the denominator becomes the largest, because the larger this is, the denominator is, the smaller the overall value R. So what if we were to plug in infinity here? If we plug in infinity here, this part would go to 0, and we would just be left with V's as naught squared over g, because overall that would go to 1. That would be 1, this part. If we were to plug in 1, which is level flight, so effectively we are not turning, load factor 1, we will plug in 1. 1 minus 1 is 0, so we would get 1 over 0. 1 over 0 is infinity, so we would get an infinite R, which also makes sense, because if we don't turn, we don't have a radius, or an infinite radius, if you will. Okay, so the equation itself makes sense, and yeah, so that is how you can do that. So again, same principle. As you can see, we have the same kind of values. So R and omega are optimized, one maximized, one minimized, for a given n at the lift limit. Okay? So let's summarize this. Sorry. Yes. Okay, now we are here. All right, so let's summarize this. So what we've seen is that when we fly at the lift limit, at our maximum sustainable N, because that was because of our assumptions, we want to be energy neutral, so we don't want to lose energy in a form of speed or altitude. Yes, N provides the best turn rate and the smallest radius for that N. So let's assume we fly at 3G. That's our maximum sustained G. Then we would go to the lift limit in terms of speed, which is square root of 3 times our stall speed in level flight, horizontal level flight. We would set our speed that way, and then we would get our maximum turn performance and maximum turn rate for that particular N. But since this is our maximum sustainable N, that will be our best turn performance. And we call this our best sustained turn speed. Now the global maximum, if you were to allow for not being energy neutral, or if you have altitude and you allow yourself to lose altitude, so you want to invest energy, you would see that you would want to go higher and higher and higher with your N toward your maximum N, and at the same time fly at a lift limit. So assume the maximum load factor we can fly without blacking out will be 6G. So we would go to 6G at, and then calculate our stall speed for 6G. We would go exactly to that speed, and that is what our corner speed is. And we've learned this when we were looking at the VN diagram. So this is our corner speed, and our best sustainable turn speeds are going to be somewhere on that line. And as I said, the higher N or load factors your airframe can sustain, the better your turn performance. So you would be somewhere on this line. Okay. Yes. And for the turn radius, and we will see this in a second, it is the same story. You want to be at corner speed if you were to allow for non-energy neutrality, if you will. But overall, the turn radius is rather constant when you fly at a lift limit. You will see this in the diagram. So it does make sense to go slow and stay at a slower, comfortable speed that you can fly and also sustain. Because if you were to fly a higher speed at a higher load factor, in real life, that would be more tiring. Okay, so that is the summary of our little experiment that we've done, thought experiment, if you will, or our analysis. And now let's see how we can visualize this. Especially for modern aircraft, these diagrams can be computed. I just used an example to walk you through that. For modern aircraft, usually in the handbooks, they should be available, the EM diagrams, because they show the turn performance of a particular airframe. This is called an energy management diagram, EM diagram, and what you can see here on the x-axis is airspeed, in this case in miles per hour, and on the y-axis you usually find degrees per second, so turn rate. Speed, airspeed, turn rate. And then you see it's a multidimensional plot, if you will. These lines here are the turn radius. So one of these lines is a constant radius. For example, the 600-foot line would be here. And then we have these G lines. So the G is equivalent to load factor, so that would be load factor 2, load factor 3, load factor 4, and they go along these. All right, so, and what can you read from this diagram? Now, I'm not sure about this formatting. Kudos, by the way, to Mr. Joseph Hong for providing this diagram publicly on the internet. I found this on Combat Sim website. I can put the link in the description, or the link is in the description. Yeah, so let's go over this real quick. I'm not sure about the formatting here, so I'm just gonna make some assumptions so you can follow through. We ignore this green line here for now. I assume that might be the one for the flaps, because with the flaps you would have a slightly better performance than without, which the formatting would indicate, but I'm not sure, so we're just going to look at the blue line for now. So what can we see here? The blue line is basically our turn rate at the lift limit for various G's. Now you can see the diagram starts at 2G, so that would be here. 1G, I don't know, would be somewhere down here, because we don't have a turn rate. So, and then it's interpolated, I think 1.1, 1.2, 1 point something G until we reach 2G. So that would be that. Okay, now what you can see here, these curves are your excess power lines. So as you can see here, PS equals 0, PS using WEP equals 0. In this case, these are your constant energy lines, okay? Excess power is 0. One for with war emergency power enabled, one without. So similar situation, DCS would be this would be using MW50, this would be using no MW50, for example, in the BF109, or water injection in the 51 or the P47. Anyway, what does this tell us? So the PS0 line tells you these are the turn rates that you can expect for various airspeeds and load factors for a constant energy neutral level turn. So let's have a look at it. We can see that the maximum is here, or maybe slightly off the lift limit, but here in this area, and you can see maybe it's because of some additional drag that we have that's theoretically not accounted for, but it's somewhere around the lift limit. So if you maneuver between the lift limit and this slightly higher speed, that would be your best turn rate. So as you can see here, if we were to fly, what is it, like 160 maybe miles per hour here, or maybe 155, something like that. If we were to fly this speed up to about 160 miles an hour, then we have our best turn rate of around maybe 13-ish degrees per second. Okay, if we were to fly at 2G, or just slightly above 2G, and 160 watt, 60 something miles per hour. Now, as you can see, if we increase our speed, not going higher in G load, so we kinda stay around the 2G mark, okay, maybe go a bit higher, but stay around that area, you will see that your turn rate goes down. So let's say we are here and we want to fly a constant constant speed. As you can see, the faster we go, at a, let's say, more or less constant G loading, we will lose turn rate. So, but look at this example this way. Let's take this speed because that intersects with various of the power lines. Let's look at 200 miles per hour. If we were to fly 200 miles per hour in this BF-109 G6, according to this diagram, if we were to fly energy neutral, we would gain somewhat, maybe about 2.3 Gs, maybe 2.4. That's here, and we cannot increase our load factor further while still being energy neutral. Only if we were to engage our war emergency power. As you can see, we can go up to about 1.5, 1.6 maybe Gs at 200 miles an hour, and would also get a higher turn rate. Now, how can we now, if we wanted to stay energy neutral, as you can see here on this turn, the only way to increase our turn rate even further is to go slower, slower, slower toward the lift limit, where we find our maximum somewhere here. Okay, so we have to decrease our speed to do this. Now, if for some reason we don't want to decrease our speed, the only way to get more performance out of the aircraft is now to accept that we would have to trade in altitude. That's why it's called PS equals, in this case, -40. I can only assume that might mean 400 feet per minute, or, and here 1,000 feet per minute. I'm not sure what this value is, or maybe 40 feet per minute. I'm not sure, but specific access power is usually in feet per minute. So it kind of tells you how much altitude would you lose, right? So it's kind of a descent rate. Okay, so if we wanted to increase our turn performance and we wanted to maintain our 200 miles per hour, we just go up here, we go up here, and we may find at some point we will hit the lift limit, so 200 miles an hour at around 3.2 G approximately, which is this point here. That's the maximum G we could fly at this speed. And then we would get this turn performance, but only so long as we have altitude to trade, as you can see. Now, what if we go to higher speeds? Let's look at, for example, 250. For the 250 miles an hour case, again, if we were to fly only at 2 Gs, just maybe slightly above 2 Gs, maybe 2.1 at this point, or 2.2. As you can see, we would be on our neutral line here, and the turn rate is definitely worse than it is over here. So the only way to increase it is to accept that we lose energy, and we go higher. Here is the -40 graph, but we can go even higher to the -100, or even higher. Not sure exactly what that would be, but definitely above -100 feet per minute. Let's just assume that's 100 feet per minute. Again, toward the lift limit, blue line, at just under 5, or more or less 5 G, 250 miles an hour. That would be our best turn performance in this case. Again, so long we have altitude to trade for. As soon as we reach the deck, this is not possible. We have to decrease our speed and go back to this line here. But as long as you have altitude to trade, as you can see, you can gain a lot more turn performance by increasing your G loading. But that would also increase, obviously, your minimum speed that you can fly. So I guess by now you understood how to read this diagram, and you can see there is a global maximum of turn rate somewhere here, about 27 maybe degrees per second, and that would be our corner speed. In this case, about 6.5 Gs, maybe 6.8. Probably that's the point where you would start to black out, or maybe secondary effects would come into play, like control stiffness, lockup, freezing, stuff like that, where you won't be able to, at some point, won't be able to pull the G's necessary. And as you can see, we just be under 300 miles per hour in this case, so around maybe, I don't know, 270, 280-ish. 280 sounds about right. Miles per hour for this BF109. And as you can see here, the radius, if we follow down this line, so long as you fly at the lift limit, the radius is relatively constant, because we just look at, okay, it's parallel to this line, so yeah, it's relatively constant. So you can comfortably fly slower speeds. As you can see here it's even a bit closer to the 800 feet line, so it's a bit less. But it's more or less constant. And if you go too slow, it does increase again, because the slower you go, the less bank angle you have, the less you actually go into the turn, and then you might have a larger radius because nothing's really pulling you around. Okay. Yeah, but if you were to maximize your radius, there's no need to trade your altitude, because you can just fly the same radius at a slower speed and be energy neutral, or just slightly higher. Okay, so that's a takeaway here as well. Generally speaking, if you wanted to find your global maximum in turn performance, you would go to the corner speed. But bear in mind, this is an instantaneous turn performance that will cost you energy, and you can only maintain this for so long until you run out of altitude. Your best sustained values are indicated by your PS0 line, so you want to be on your PS0 line if possible, to, you know, not lose your altitude. Because the thing is, even if you initially gain turn performance by going to a higher G loading and a higher speed, to more closer toward your corner speed, if the other guy doesn't trade his altitude, eventually he will have an energy advantage on you, and then it doesn't matter that you are on his 6, because you're already like 1,000 meters below him, and then he's got all the cards in his hands. So you got to be careful when you trade your energy for a quick instantaneous turn performance boost when you do that. Okay, so that concludes our lesson on turn performance, aircraft performance then in general. And the next videos are then going to be about the actual air combat. But these fundamentals are important, that you understand them, that you have at least thought about it a little bit, and that you've heard about it, so you kind of know what to look for now when you seek to improve your flying. For those of you that are interested, I'm going to add the section where we go over the equations, and I'll show you how to arrive here with the knowledge that we've gained from the previous lessons. For those of you that are not interested in that, I guess I will see you in the next one. Killerfliege out. Welcome back, everyone. For those of you that are interested in a little bit of mathematic juggling, here we go. And I want to show you real quick how to get to the solutions that we found earlier for turn rate and turn radius. Now, these equations that I've shown you earlier are actually general equations, so even if we didn't look at the maximum of these equations, you can find the theoretical turn rate and turn radius your aircraft can do, in our case under the assumption that we are energy neutral. Okay, now this was our first equation that we've looked at. We are starting with turn rate, and our turn rate is equal to the square root of the horizontal lift component divided by r times mass of the aircraft. Now, how do we simplify that? Now, the first thing that we want to look at is the following. We've already established, using our trigonometry skills and the graph here, pull this up real quick for you here, that we can use our cosine and sine and the bank angle to find the horizontal and vertical lift components. So we are just going to do that, and we've also seen this in previous videos. So our horizontal lift component is hence equivalent to sine of bank angle times total lift. Why? We can draw this again. We have our L total. We have our, oops, a bit far, horizontal lift component. We have our vertical lift component. These are the wings. There is our bank angle here, and we can also write LH here, and then it should be obvious. Okay, so important. Now let's plug this in first to see how that goes. So we have sine beta times L total divided by R times mass of the aircraft. Alright, so next up, we also know the following. The weight pulling on the aircraft is equivalent to our vertical lift component because we want to have a constant altitude. Because we want to be energy neutral. Alright, so our vertical lift component is cosine beta times L tot. Alright, so our weight is equal to cosine beta times L tot, and that means our lift total is weight over cosine beta. Now that's awesome, because the weight we can rewrite mass of the aircraft times gravitational constant. So we have mass of the aircraft times gravitational constant divided by cosine beta. So let's plug this in here. And we get to the following. So omega equals sine beta times weight over cosine beta times MAC times gravitational constant divided by R times mass of the aircraft. The reason why we did this and what's so beautiful about it is that we can eliminate the mass of the aircraft. Isn't that cool? So you know, experienced people among you would probably see that sine beta divided by cosine beta is actually tangents beta, but we don't want to use that right now, because 1 over cosine beta we can transfer in to n, because that's the definition that we did in the previous videos. Our load factor is defined as 1 over cosine beta, because hence it gives us the amount. It basically describes how much I have to increase my total lift component depending on my bank angle to maintain level flight. So hence we'll read it, we'll keep it as such, because this 1 over cosine beta we can actually write as n load factor. So what we are left with is our sine beta times sorry, I did a miss. Of course the weight is this, so I have to make this real quick like this. I was a bit fast here, so the weight obviously is this, so we don't want to introduce it twice. So I correct this. This is our n, so it's n times g divided by r. Okay, now most of you probably know that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So we can use this to say 1 minus cosine squared beta equals sine beta squared, and then the square root of 1 minus cosine squared beta equals sine beta, because the cosine we can somewhat then transfer to n or to the load factor. That's why we are doing this. So we can write this out real quick. So we have omega equals square root of 1 minus cosine squared beta times n times g over r. Now we would like to get rid of this r first, so let me rearrange to make it a bit simpler to follow. We separate the components now that we don't need for now, so we will write it as such: omega equals, I'll keep the n's in one and the others in another one, so let's rearrange it as such: g over r times and then we can leave it as such, n times square root of 1 minus cosine squared beta. Okay. From this equation we know that cosine beta, from up here, we know that cosine beta is 1 over n. That means cosine squared beta is 1 over n squared. 1 squared is 1, so that's that. We can use this to eliminate the cosine beta in the following equation. Okay, times n times square root of 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, now that's a bit clumsy, so we'll make it a bit simpler. We can put this n into here by squaring it. So n times 1 minus 1 over n squared equals square root of n squared times 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, the reason why we are doing this becomes apparent. Now we put it into here, or we multiply it into the brackets, and then we are left with n squared minus 1. Much simpler. Alright, so this is n squared minus 1, so currently we are standing at by r times n squared minus 1. Okay, now as I've pointed out earlier in the video, we want to get rid of this r, because that's still something that we cannot really grasp. But what we know is that omega is v over r, or in other words, omega times r equals v. Okay, so so what we can do here is r is then v divided by omega. Okay. Sorry, did I do this correct? Hang on, let me quickly think about it. Have I done something? Sorry. Yes, we write it as such. So v, our speed, is omega times r. Now we are correct. So omega is v over r. Sorry. Yes, so r is hence, but that was correct, v over omega, right? So we can plug this in here. So we have written here omega equals square root of g divided by v, and this would be v over omega, so omega goes up. Okay. Or I can write it out like this, divided by omega, still everything in the square root, times n squared minus 1. Okay, now this goes up. So we have already values that we can manipulate, so I write it a bit separately. So we have omega equals g over v times square root of omega times square root n squared minus 1. Now obviously we need to bring this to the left side, because it cannot have the variables, same variables on opposite sides. So we have omega over square root of omega equals g over v times square root n squared minus 1. Now this is square root of omega, so square root of omega equals, let me call this a, write it a bit simpler. So omega is hence a squared, is hence g over v times square root of n squared minus 1. And that's exactly what we had earlier in the presentation. And now we have only quantities here that we can actually manipulate, or that we know because they're constant, like the gravitational constant. Let's have a look real quick if we are correct. G over v, and that looks good. Yes. Alright, so turn radius. Now I've written it out already, because that's what we already know. Our turn radius coming from Newton's equation. We can find this, so because centripetal force is our horizontal lift force, and is hence this. And using the equations from above to make stuff already simpler, we have sine beta times L tot is mass of the aircraft times g, which is the weight, over cosine beta divided by omega squared mac. So this goes, and we are left with sine beta times g times n, 1 over cosine n, divided by omega squared. Now, again, omega times r equals, no, sorry, omega gleich, let's go up, yeah, v is gleich omega times r, so omega times r equals v, r is hence, sorry, that means omega is v over r. We can put this in here, so we get, it's then sine beta times g times n divided by v squared times r squared. Yeah. Okay. Then we rearrange, we divide by r, and we put all of this on the other side. So we get r equals v squared divided by g times sine beta times n. Okay. Now we rewrite this again. So is square root of 1 minus cosine beta equals sine beta. And we already know that, squared. And we already know that this is 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, so r equals v squared divided by g times n times square root of 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, now we can plug this into the equation here, into the square root, so r equals v squared divided by g times, hang on, I think I made a mistake. Hang on real quick. Yes, of course. Oops, sorry. Sine obviously has to go down and n has to go down. So let's do it slowly real quick. So r equals, now everything needs to turn around. So v squared divided by g times 1 over n times sine beta. Yeah, because that needs to go, all of this needs to become the denominator. Okay, but this still applies. We just need to rearrange that or correct that. So we have r equals v squared divided by g times 1 over n times square root of 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, now we multiply this into the square root to make it a bit simpler. So r equals v squared divided by n, 1 over, and then we have n squared times 1 minus 1 over n squared. And then we end up with v squared divided by g plus 1 over n squared minus 1. And I believe this is what we got earlier for r as well. Let's have a look-see. is v squared over g 1 over n squared minus 1. Okay. So that's that. So now you know how you get to the equations. And regarding the limit, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the limit, so I'm gonna not go much into it, but I think you can figure this out on your own. Basically, what you have to consider. So the omega is rather simple. So let's write down the equation. Now, why don't we just do it real quick? So let's write down the equations that we got. N squared minus 1. Okay. And R equals v squared divided by g 1 over n squared minus 1. Okay, now let's form the limit. The first thing we do is that we say v equals v as 0 times n, because we want to be at the lift limit to minimize our stall speed. So we plug this in for both. So this is g over v as naught. Sorry. Square root, obviously, times square root of n times n squared minus 1. Let's simplify this real quick. Is hence g over v as 0 times n squared minus 1 divided by n. We can write this under the same square root. So we make a big one out of it. N squared minus 1 divided by n. We rearrange it a little bit, which will help us for the limit. So n squared over n minus 1 over n is hence g divided by s naught times n minus 1 over n. Okay, and now limit omega n toward n max is hence limit n toward n max. And then for omega we have this equation is g over v as naught n max minus 1 over n max. And if you were to go toward infinity, that would become 0, and then we would have infinity. But obviously that's unreasonable. And that is exactly what we've gotten for the limit s. Okay. So we can do the same thing for our radius. Right, so with the same simplification, we can write down radius equals v as naught squared divided by g times n, yeah, because square root of n squared is n, times, let's write it like this, 1 over, this is equivalent, 1 over n squared minus 1. Okay, again we do the same thing, so is hence, let me frame this real quick so you can follow along. Okay, So is hence V as naught squared divided by G times. Now, in order to bring it in here, we need to square n. So when we take it out again, we would end up with only n. N squared minus 1. Okay, we've rearranged this a little bit because writing a limit out like this, if you were to use infinity or 0, doesn't really work well. So we are going to adjust it slightly. And we are going to take the n squared out of both. So we want to do basically n squared over n squared times 1 over so n squared out of here, so that will leave us with 1 minus 1 over n squared. Let me write this. So this goes to 1 is then V as naught squared divided by G times 1 minus 1 over n squared. The reason why we've done this now, if we were to plug in an infinity here, we would end up at this 0, and if we were to put a 1 here, we would get the results that we had earlier. So that's nice. Sorry, we want to explore the limits now. Limit. So limit r n toward n max is hence limit n toward n max V as 0 squared divided by G times 1 over 1 minus 1 over n max squared. And we can write this a little nicer. V as naught squared divided by, sorry, we cannot write the max here because that's what we plug in, we just keep it n squared. We can write it a little nicer, so bear with me. V as times, because square root of 1 is 1, so we can write 1 over and then the square root at the bottom here, 1 minus 1 over n max squared. And that is, I believe, what we have found earlier as well. And you see the higher n, the higher n, the larger this sum gets, because there's a minus here, and if we subtract less from 1, it's going to be higher overall. Okay. Let's just make sure we didn't make any mistake. V squared times 1 minus 1 over n squared. Okay, and I guess that is correct. So now you've seen how we derived those equations earlier and how we found our performance limits mathematically. Okay, so that's it from my side. Killer Fliege out.